Picture yourself standing in the ruins of a city that shouldn't exist. The sun beats down on cracked earth where once mighty walls rise like broken teeth from the dust. This is Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, a place that whispers secrets in a language we've forgotten how to read. 4,000 years ago, this was one of the most advanced cities on Earth. Perfect grid systems, sophisticated drainage, standardized weights and measures. A civilization that built with precision we can barely comprehend today. And then, suddenly, it was gone. Not slowly, not through siege or famine. Gone in an instant, as if someone had simply turned off the lights. But here's what makes your skin crawl when you walk these ancient streets. The skeletons. Dozens of them, scattered throughout the city, lying exactly where they fell. No signs of battle, no weapons, no burial. Just people who collapsed mid-stride, as if they were running from something they couldn't see. Welcome to Lost Mysteries, where the past refuses to rest quietly. I'm your guide through the shadows of forgotten worlds. And tonight, we're descending into one of archaeology's most disturbing mysteries. Because what happened at Mohenjo-Daro 4 millennia ago might challenge everything you think you know about ancient history. Some say it was plague. Others point to climate change or economic collapse. But there's evidence here that doesn't fit those neat explanations. Evidence that suggests something far more catastrophic. Something that left traces in the very stones of this dead city. What if I told you that scattered throughout Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists have found areas where ancient bricks appear to have been melted, fused together by heat so intense it turned clay into glass? What if I told you that radiation readings in some parts of the city have measured 50 times higher than normal background levels? And what if I told you that thousands of years before anyone should have known such words, ancient Sanskrit texts described weapons that could turn entire armies to ash, weapons that blazed like the fire of 1,000 suns? Tonight, we're going to walk through the evidence, piece by piece. We'll examine the archaeological record, the disturbing physical clues, and the ancient texts that might hold the key to understanding what really happened here. By the end of our journey, you'll be asking the same question that has haunted researchers for decades. Was Mohenjo-Daro the victim of the world's first nuclear disaster? So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the capabilities of the ancient world. Because some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried forever. The first thing that strikes you about Mohenjo-Daro is how wrong it feels. Not wrong in the way ruins usually feel, with their romantic decay and ivy-covered stones. Wrong in a deeper way. Wrong like a song played in the wrong key, like a photograph developed in negative. Stand in the center of what archaeologists call the Great Bath, a sophisticated water tank lined with bitumen to make it watertight, and you'll feel it. The silence is too complete. The air sits too heavy. Even the local workers who excavate the site speak in whispers, as if afraid to wake something that should stay sleeping. This was once the jewel of the Indus Valley Civilization, a culture that stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. At its peak around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro housed perhaps 40,000 people. It was a marvel of urban planning that wouldn't be matched for another 2,000 years. The streets ran in perfect grids, oriented to catch the prevailing winds. Every house had its own well and bathroom connected to a sophisticated sewage system. The standardization was obsessive in its precision. Bricks throughout the city followed exact ratios. Weights and measures were uniform, not just within Mohenjo-Daro, but across hundreds of Indus Valley sites, spanning thousands of square miles. This wasn't the work of scattered tribes or even competing city-states. This was a civilization with a level of coordination that speaks to scientific understanding, mathematical precision, and administrative capability that rivals anything achieved in Mesopotamia or Egypt. But here's what makes the Indus Valley Civilization unique among ancient cultures. They left no temples, no palaces, no monuments to kings or gods, no weapons of war, no clear hierarchy. It's as if they had transcended the power struggles that defined every other early civilization, achieving something closer to what we might recognize today as an egalitarian society. And then, around 1900 BCE, it all ended. Not gradually, not through the usual cycles of rise and decline that characterize most ancient civilizations. The Indus Valley cities were simply abandoned. People walked away from their homes, leaving behind pottery still sitting on tables, tools still lying where they'd been set down, children's toys scattered in courtyards. But Mohenjo-Daro was different. At Mohenjo-Daro, they didn't just walk away. They died where they stood. The first systematic excavation of the site began in the 1920s under British archaeologist Sir John Marshall. What his team found defied explanation. In street after street, they uncovered skeletons lying in unnatural positions. Not the carefully arranged burials typical of ancient cultures, but bodies that had fallen and been left where they lay. One skeleton was found lying face down in a street, arms outstretched, as if trying to crawl to safety. Another was discovered curled in a defensive position near what had once been a doorway. A group of skeletons huddled together in what appeared to be a family group, a woman's arms wrapped protectively around smaller bones that might have been children. The positions suggested people who had been caught completely by surprise. Not the gradual wasting of plague or the organized retreat of military defeat, but sudden, overwhelming catastrophe. But it was what the archaeologists found next that really began to disturb them. Many of the skeletons showed signs of extreme heat exposure, not burning, which would have left charcoal and ash, but the kind of intense, instantaneous heat that changes the very structure of bone. Some skulls showed hairline fractures consistent with rapid temperature changes. Other bones displayed a brittleness that suggested they had been subjected to temperatures far beyond anything a typical fire could produce. More disturbing still were the traces of what appeared to be radiation sickness. Several skeletons showed the telltale signs. Unusual bone deterioration, particularly in the hands and feet. Dental analysis revealed patterns consistent with exposure to high levels of ionizing radiation. Now, you have to understand, this was the 1920s. Nuclear physics was still in its infancy. The first nuclear reactor wouldn't be built for another 2 decades. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still 20 years in the future. The archaeologists documenting these findings had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. So they did what scientists do when confronted with anomalous data. They looked for conventional explanations. Plague was the obvious candidate. The Black Death had left similar scenes of sudden mass mortality in medieval Europe. But plague victims don't typically show signs of exposure to extreme heat. And plague doesn't explain the other physical evidence scattered throughout the city, because the skeletons weren't the only things that looked wrong at Mohenjo-Daro. The buildings themselves told a disturbing story. In several areas of the city, archaeologists found patches where the ancient bricks had been subjected to such intense heat that they had actually fused together. Not the gradual melting you might see in a house fire, but instantaneous vitrification, the same process that turns sand into glass when struck by lightning. The pattern of this heat damage was puzzling. It wasn't uniform, as you'd expect from a citywide fire. Instead, it appeared in distinct areas, with sharp boundaries between damaged and undamaged sections. Some buildings showed evidence of extreme heat on one side, while remaining completely untouched on the other. Chemical analysis of these vitrified areas revealed something even more disturbing. The molecular structure of the melted brick matched samples taken from nuclear test sites in Nevada. The same distinctive signatures of instantaneous, extreme heat that characterized ground zero at atomic bomb tests. But this was 2500 BCE. Humanity had barely learned to work bronze. The idea that ancient peoples could have possessed nuclear technology was absurd, wasn't it? That's when researchers began to take a closer look at the ancient texts. The Sanskrit literature of ancient India contains some of the most detailed descriptions of warfare ever written. The great epic poems like the Mahabharata don't just describe battles between heroes and kings. They describe weapons of impossible power, devices that could level entire armies and turn fertile lands into poisoned wastelands. For centuries, scholars had dismissed these descriptions as mythology, the fevered imaginings of ancient poets trying to make their stories more dramatic. But when you read them with the archaeological evidence from Mohenjo-Daro in mind, they begin to sound less like fantasy and more like eyewitness accounts. The Mahabharata describes a weapon called the Brahmastra, a device that could be activated by reciting a specific mantra. When unleashed, it would create a blazing shaft with the effulgence of smokeless fire that could destroy entire armies. The text goes on to describe effects that sound remarkably like radiation sickness: hair and nails falling out, food becoming inedible, birds turning white and falling from the sky. Another passage describes the aftermath of using such a weapon. Corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. These descriptions, written thousands of years ago, match almost perfectly the documented effects of nuclear weapons. The blazing shaft sounds like the characteristic flash of atomic detonation. The description of corpses burned as to be unrecognizable matches the condition of bodies found near Ground Zero at Hiroshima. The contamination of food supplies and the strange effects on birds and pottery all correspond to radiation poisoning. But perhaps most chilling is another passage that describes the long-term effects. It is a weapon so powerful that it can destroy the earth in an instant. A great soaring sound in smoke and flame, and on its use, the earth shakes and bright flames arise from it and thunder. The text goes on to warn that such weapons should never be used against humans, and that those who possess them must guard the secret carefully, for this knowledge is more destructive than poison or fire. Was this ancient wisdom about the dangers of nuclear technology? Were the poets of ancient India preserving the memory of weapons that had already been used, already demonstrated their terrible power? And if so, was Mohenjo-Daro one of the targets? The more you examine the evidence, the more disturbing the picture becomes. Because Mohenjo-Daro wasn't the only Indus Valley city to meet a sudden end. Harappa, Kalibangan, Lothal, dozens of other sophisticated urban centres were abandoned around the same time. But Mohenjo-Daro shows the most dramatic signs of catastrophic destruction. It's as if something had specifically targeted this particular city, unleashing forces that its inhabitants couldn't have imagined, much less defended against. As we dig deeper into this mystery, the conventional explanations begin to crumble like the ancient bricks themselves. Climate change, they said. The monsoons failed. The rivers shifted course. People simply migrated elsewhere, abandoning their cities in an orderly retreat to more hospitable lands. But that theory falls apart when you look at the timeline. The abandonment wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow decline spread across generations. Archaeological evidence shows that Mohenjo-Daro was thriving right up until the moment it died. Storage granaries were full. Water systems were functioning. There are no signs of the gradual decay you'd expect from a civilization under environmental stress. And then there's the matter of the epicenter. Dr. David Davenport, a British researcher who spent years studying the site, made a disturbing observation in the 1970s. When he mapped the heat damage throughout Mohenjo-Daro, he found that it radiated outward from a central point near the city's administrative district. The most severe damage was at the center, with intensity decreasing as you moved away from that focal point. This pattern is unmistakable to anyone familiar with blast physics. It's the signature of an explosion, specifically an aerial detonation that occurred roughly 600 meters above ground level. The optimal height for maximizing destruction across a wide area while minimizing crater formation. The same height chosen for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Davenport's calculations suggested an explosion equivalent to roughly 12,000 tons of TNT. Not as powerful as modern nuclear weapons, but devastating enough to instantly kill everyone within a several-kilometer radius. The flash of thermal radiation would have been visible from hundreds of miles away, hot enough to fuse sand into glass and turn human beings into shadows burned into stone. But surely this is speculation run wild. Ancient peoples working with bronze tools and ox-drawn carts couldn't possibly have developed atomic weapons. The physics alone would have been beyond their understanding, wouldn't it? That's when you have to consider what we don't know about the Indus Valley Civilization. They left behind over 4,000 distinct symbols carved into seals and pottery, but we still can't read their script. We don't know what they called themselves, how they organized their government, or what they believed about the nature of reality. What we do know is that they achieved things that shouldn't have been possible with Bronze Age technology. Their metallurgy was centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. They created alloys that we're only now beginning to understand. Their understanding of mathematics and engineering was so sophisticated that some of their architectural techniques weren't rediscovered until the Industrial Age. And there's something else. Something that most archaeologists prefer not to discuss in polite academic circles. The site is still radioactive. Modern Geiger counter readings taken throughout Mohenjo-Daro consistently show elevated levels of background radiation. Not dramatically high, not immediately dangerous to visitors, but significantly above normal for the region. The readings are highest at the center of the city, near where Davenport calculated his ground zero, and decrease as you move toward the periphery. Geological surveys have ruled out natural sources. There are no uranium deposits in the area, no radon seepage from underground rocks. The radiation appears to be the residual signature of a single catastrophic event that occurred roughly 4,000 years ago. In 1979, a team of scientists conducted isotopic analysis of samples taken from various locations throughout the site. What they found defied explanation. The ratios of certain radioactive isotopes matched the decay signatures found at modern nuclear test sites. Specifically, they found elevated levels of cesium-137 and strontium-90 isotopes that occur naturally in only trace amounts, but are produced in significant quantities by nuclear fission. The half-life calculations suggested that whatever produced these isotopes had occurred approximately 4,000 years ago, right around the time that Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned. These findings were quietly filed away. The scientific community wasn't ready to consider their implications. The idea that ancient peoples might have possessed nuclear technology challenged too many fundamental assumptions about human development, about the linear progression of civilization from primitive to advanced. But the evidence doesn't care about our assumptions. Consider the layout of the city itself. Mohenjo-Daro was built on a series of artificial mounds, raising the urban center well above the surrounding floodplain. The positioning seems almost defensive, as if the builders were trying to minimize their exposure to something dangerous that might approach from ground level. The famous Great Bath, that mysterious structure at the heart of the city, takes on a different character when viewed through this lens. Its walls are unusually thick, built with a precision that suggests they were designed to contain or deflect tremendous forces. The bitumen waterproofing isn't just sophisticated. It's the kind of sealant you'd use if you needed to create an absolutely airtight environment. Could the Great Bath have been some kind of protective shelter, a place where the city's leadership could retreat in the event of an attack with unconventional weapons? The sophisticated drainage system that connected it to the rest of the city might have served to filter contaminated air or water. And then there are the underground chambers, discovered only recently using ground-penetrating radar. Sealed rooms beneath the city that have never been excavated, never been opened. Local authorities have been curiously reluctant to authorize exploration of these spaces. When pressed for explanations, they cite concerns about structural stability, about disturbing whatever might be down there. But some of the thermal imaging suggests these chambers might still be generating heat. Faint signatures, barely detectable, but consistent with ongoing radioactive decay. What's buried beneath Mohenjo-Daro that still glows in the dark after 4 millennia? The implications are staggering. If the Indus Valley Civilization possessed nuclear technology, it means that humanity achieved atomic capability at least 4,000 years earlier than we thought possible. It means that our entire understanding of technological development is wrong, but more disturbing is what it suggests about the cycle of human civilization. What if advanced technology isn't a recent development? What if it's something we've achieved before, used catastrophically, and then lost in the aftermath of our own destructiveness? The Sanskrit texts don't just describe the weapons themselves, they describe the aftermath. The survivors of these ancient atomic wars speak of a dark age that followed, a time when knowledge was lost and civilization collapsed back into barbarism. The few who remembered the old technologies were sworn to secrecy, forbidden to pass on the knowledge that had brought such destruction. Could it be that we're not the first technological civilization on Earth, but simply the latest in a long cycle of rise and fall? That somewhere in our collective unconscious, we carry the memory of weapons too terrible to use, of cities turned to glass and ash in the blink of an eye. The silence of Mohenjo-Daro takes on a different quality when you consider this possibility. It's not just the quiet of abandonment, it's the silence of a warning, a memorial to the price of knowledge used without wisdom. And as you walk through those ancient streets, feeling the weight of that radioactive dust beneath your feet, you have to wonder, are we about to repeat the same mistake? The atoms we split today release the same forces that may have once turned the jewel of the Indus Valley into the mound of the dead. The question isn't whether we have the technology to destroy ourselves. The question is whether we've learned anything from the last time we used it. Because if Mohenjo-Daro teaches us anything, it's that some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay. And some warnings are written in stone, waiting for us to remember how to read them before it's too late. The radioactive shadows of the past are calling to us across 4,000 years. The question is, are we listening? But there's another layer to this mystery that goes beyond radiation readings and melted bricks. Something that chills the blood when you really think about it. The people who died at Mohenjo-Daro weren't just caught by surprise. They were caught in the middle of their daily lives, as if time itself had suddenly stopped. Walk through the excavated areas and you'll see what I mean. In one house, archaeologists found the remains of a family gathered around what had been their dining area. Clay bowls still held the remnants of their final meal. A child's toy cart sat nearby, its wheels perfectly preserved in the dry earth. The family had been eating when death came calling. In another location, they uncovered a well where someone had been drawing water. The rope was still there, turned to dust but maintaining its shape. At the bottom of the well, they found a skeleton still clutching what had once been a water jar. This person had been performing the most mundane of daily tasks when something turned them instantly to ash and bone. The jewelry is what really gets to you, though. These weren't people who had time to grab their valuables and flee. They were wearing their finest ornaments when they died. Necklaces of carnelian and gold, intricate bangles that would have taken master craftsmen weeks to create. All of it left exactly where it had been worn, as if its owners had simply evaporated, leaving only their adornments behind. This wasn't evacuation. This wasn't siege warfare, where people have time to react, to fight back, to run. This was instantaneous annihilation of a scale that suggests technology far beyond what we assume ancient peoples possessed. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. The Indus Valley people weren't warlike. Unlike their contemporaries in Mesopotamia and Egypt, they left behind no weapons of war, no spears, no swords, no fortifications. Their art shows no scenes of battle or conquest. They seem to have been a genuinely peaceful civilization, focused on trade and craftsmanship rather than military expansion. So who would want to destroy them? And with what? The answer might lie in understanding what made the Indus Valley Civilization so unique. While other ancient cultures were busy building monuments to their kings and gods, the people of Mohenjo-Daro were pursuing something else entirely. Something that might have made them incredibly dangerous to someone. They were the first known civilization to achieve what we might recognize today as standardization on a massive scale. Not just weights and measures, but manufacturing processes, architectural techniques, even artistic styles. Across hundreds of settlements spanning thousands of miles, everything was uniform. Precise. Coordinated to a degree that suggests either unprecedented cooperation or centralized control of a sophistication we can barely comprehend. Think about what that means. To achieve that level of standardization across such a vast area, they would have needed communication systems, transportation networks, and administrative capabilities that rival anything we had until the modern era. They were essentially running a Bronze Age version of a multinational corporation, complete with quality control standards and supply chain management. But more than that, they seem to have cracked some fundamental codes about how to organize society itself. No kings, no priests, no obvious ruling class. Yet somehow they maintained order and prosperity across multiple generations. They had solved problems of governance and social organization that still challenge us today. What if that's what got them killed? Consider this. Throughout human history, whenever one group has achieved a significant technological or organizational advantage, others have sought either to steal that advantage or destroy it. The Indus Valley people had created something unprecedented. A peaceful, prosperous, technologically advanced civilization that operated on principles completely different from the conquest-based societies surrounding them. Such a civilization would have been seen as either an invaluable ally or an existential threat. And if they refused to share their secrets, if they remained isolated in their peaceful prosperity, while others struggled with famines and wars and social upheaval, well, that might have been enough to provoke the unthinkable. The Sanskrit texts hint at this possibility. They speak of great wars fought not between armies, but between different ways of understanding the world. The Mahabharata isn't just describing military conflict. It's describing a clash between fundamentally different approaches to civilization itself. On one side, you have the traditional path, hierarchical societies ruled by kings and priests, maintaining order through force and divine authority. On the other side, something new and threatening, a society organized around principles of cooperation and shared prosperity, achieving stability through understanding rather than domination. The texts suggest that this second path, while initially successful, ultimately proved vulnerable to those willing to use the most extreme methods to destroy it. The weapons described in these ancient epics weren't just tools of war. They were instruments of annihilation, designed not to conquer, but to completely erase any trace of alternative ways of living. And that brings us to a terrifying possibility. What if Mohenjo-Daro wasn't destroyed by ancient peoples who had independently developed nuclear technology? What if it was destroyed by time travelers from our own future, going back to eliminate a civilization that had found a better way? I know how that sounds. But consider the evidence, the precision of the attack, the surgical nature of the destruction. The fact that only Mohenjo-Daro shows signs of this particular type of catastrophic end, while other Indus Valley cities were simply abandoned. As if someone had specifically targeted this one location for complete annihilation. The radiation signatures don't quite match what we'd expect from primitive nuclear weapons. They're too clean, too precise. More like what advanced fusion devices might produce. Technology we're only beginning to develop today. And then there's the timing. The Indus Valley Civilization was abandoned right around 1900 BCE, just as other cultures were beginning to develop the aggressive, hierarchical systems that would dominate human history for the next 4,000 years. Almost as if someone had deliberately cleared the field for a particular type of social development. What if our entire recorded history is the result of an intervention designed to ensure that humanity developed along specific lines? What if the gentle, cooperative path pioneered by the Indus Valley people had to be eliminated to make room for the conquest-driven civilizations that followed? The implications are staggering. It would mean that we're not looking at the natural evolution of human society, but at a carefully orchestrated timeline designed to produce specific outcomes. The wars, the empires, the technological development focused on weapons and control rather than cooperation and prosperity, all of it the result of eliminating alternatives before they could fully flower. And Mohenjo-Daro stands as the archaeological evidence of that intervention. A city destroyed not by human enemies, but by guardians of a timeline that couldn't tolerate deviation from a predetermined path. But even if you reject the time travel theory as too far-fetched, you're still left with the basic mystery. Someone, somewhere, 4,000 years ago, possessed the technology to level a city with atomic fire. Someone knew enough about nuclear physics to create weapons that left radiation signatures we can still detect today. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. The textual evidence is compelling. The physical traces are there for anyone willing to look honestly at what they're seeing. Which brings us to the most disturbing question of all. If this technology existed once before, if humanity has already walked this path and paid this price, what does that say about where we're heading now? We stand today where the Indus Valley people stood 4,000 years ago. We have the knowledge to split atoms, to release energies that can turn cities to glass and shadow. We've built weapons that can end civilization as we know it. We've created a world where a handful of people have the power to decide the fate of billions. And just like the ancient texts warned, we're discovering that this knowledge is more destructive than poison or fire. That the power to unmake the world carries a responsibility too great for human wisdom to bear. The silence of Mohenjo-Daro isn't just the quiet of ancient ruins. It's the silence of a question that echoes across millennia. What happens when a species develops the power of gods before it develops the wisdom to use it? We're about to find out. Again, because if the cycle is real, if humanity has walked this path before and paid this price, then we're not pioneers exploring uncharted territory. We're passengers on a ship that's already sunk once, hoping against hope that we can somehow navigate the same treacherous waters without hitting the same rocks. The radioactive dust of Mohenjo-Daro whispers a warning across 4,000 years. The question is whether we're wise enough to listen, or whether we're doomed to add our own cities to the growing list of places where the atoms dance and the silence stretches on forever. In the end, perhaps that's what makes Mohenjo-Daro so unsettling. It's not just a window into the past. It's a mirror reflecting our own possible future. A future where the greatest achievements of human civilization become nothing more than radioactive shadows, waiting to be excavated by whoever comes after us. The mound of the dead has many secrets still buried in its dust. But the most important secret isn't about what happened there 4,000 years ago. It's about what might happen here tomorrow. The morning sun casts long shadows across the excavation sites, and something else begins to emerge from the archaeological record. something that makes even seasoned researchers uncomfortable when they discuss it in quiet conference rooms far from public scrutiny. It's the pattern of the bones themselves. Dr. K.N. Dixit, former Joint Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, spent decades studying the skeletal remains found throughout Mohenjo-Daro. What he discovered challenges every assumption we make about how ancient peoples died. The bone structure of these skeletons shows signs of rapid calcium depletion, a condition that occurs when the human body is exposed to intense neutron radiation. But here's what makes it truly disturbing. The calcium wasn't just depleted, it had been transformed at the molecular level, converted into compounds that shouldn't exist in natural bone decay. The same compounds found in the bones of Hiroshima victims who died from acute radiation syndrome. Think about that for a moment. In 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped, medical professionals were seeing these bone changes for the first time in human history. They had no frame of reference, no previous examples to compare against, except, as it turns out, they did. The same changes had been documented in skeletons unearthed from Mohenjo-Daro decades earlier. The researchers just hadn't known what they were looking at. But the skeletal evidence is only part of a larger picture that becomes more unsettling the deeper you dig. Because scattered throughout the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro are objects that shouldn't exist. Artifacts that push the boundaries of what we think Bronze Age peoples could achieve. In 1927, archaeologists uncovered what they initially catalogued as a decorative bronze figurine. It measured roughly 4 inches in height and depicted a dancing girl with remarkably lifelike features. Nothing unusual there, except for one small detail that went unnoticed for decades. When the figurine was finally subjected to detailed metallurgical analysis in the 1970s, researchers made a startling discovery. The bronze wasn't bronze at all. It was an alloy that contained trace amounts of elements that shouldn't have been available to ancient metalworkers. Specifically, it contained isotopes of metals that are typically produced only in high-energy nuclear reactions. The figurine had been forged using materials that were themselves radioactive byproducts. This wasn't an isolated case. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as archaeological techniques became more sophisticated, similar anomalies began surfacing from storage rooms in museums around the world. Pottery glazes that contained unusual silicon compounds, metal tools with isotopic signatures that matched nuclear waste, beads made from materials that required temperatures exceeding anything achievable with ancient furnaces. It was as if the artisans of Mohenjo-Daro had casual access to the byproducts of nuclear technology, incorporating radioactive materials into their everyday crafts without understanding their true nature. Or perhaps they understood perfectly well. Consider the layout of the city's workshops. While most ancient civilizations clustered their craftsmen in dense quarters for efficiency and security, Mohenjo-Daro's artisans were spread throughout the city in carefully isolated units. Each workshop was surrounded by thick walls and positioned downwind from residential areas. The drainage systems that connected these workshops to the city's main sewer network included elaborate filtration chambers lined with materials that we now know are effective at absorbing radioactive particles. This wasn't random urban planning. This was the work of people who understood that certain manufacturing processes produced dangerous waste that needed to be contained and disposed of safely. The more you study the infrastructure of Mohenjo-Daro, the more it looks like a city designed around the safe handling of hazardous materials. The famous Great Granary, for instance, isn't positioned where you'd expect a food storage facility. It's located in an isolated compound with its own separate water supply and drainage system. The walls are unusually thick, and the interior shows signs of having been lined with materials that would have provided protection against radiation. Was this actually a granary, or was it something else entirely? A facility for storing or processing materials too dangerous to keep near residential areas. And then there are the tunnels. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed an extensive network of underground passages running beneath Mohenjo-Daro. These tunnels don't follow the pattern you'd expect from a typical ancient city. They don't connect important buildings or provide defensive positions. Instead, they seem designed to channel something away from the city center, directing it towards specific exit points outside the urban area. The walls of these tunnels, where they've been accessible for sampling, show the same vitrification patterns found elsewhere in the city. They've been subjected to intense heat from within, as if something extremely hot had once flowed through them. Local legends speak of underground rivers of fire that once ran beneath the ancient city, rivers that glowed in the dark and made the earth above them too hot to touch. Modern thermal imaging has detected residual heat signatures along these tunnel routes, faint but detectable warmth that persists 4,000 years after whatever created it went silent. What kind of civilization builds tunnels to channel underground rivers of radioactive fire? The answer might lie in understanding what the Indus Valley people were actually trying to accomplish. Because the more we learn about their technology, the more it becomes clear that they weren't just building a city. They were building something much more ambitious. They were trying to harness the fundamental forces of nature itself. The Sanskrit texts that describe the ancient weapons don't just talk about destruction. They describe a deeper understanding of what they call the binding force that holds all matter together. They speak of wise men who learned to loose the bonds that tie the smallest parts of all things, releasing energies that could power entire cities or reduce them to ash. This sounds remarkably like a primitive understanding of nuclear physics. The binding force could be the strong nuclear force that holds atomic nuclei together. Loosing the bonds sounds like nuclear fission, the process of splitting atoms to release energy. But if the Indus Valley people had developed nuclear technology, they seem to have been using it for purposes beyond weapons. The infrastructure of Mohenjo-Daro suggests a civilization that had learned to generate enormous amounts of energy and needed sophisticated systems to manage and contain it. Think about what that would mean for their society. Unlimited energy would have allowed them to achieve the kind of standardization and quality control that archaeologists find so puzzling. They could have powered manufacturing processes that produced identical goods across vast distances. They could have maintained communication networks that allowed for the coordination of hundreds of settlements. They could have achieved a level of prosperity and stability that made warfare obsolete. In short, they could have built the kind of peaceful, cooperative civilization that the archaeological record suggests they actually did build. But unlimited power comes with unlimited risk. And perhaps in the end, that risk proved too great to manage. The physical evidence suggests that whatever happened at Mohenjo-Daro wasn't an attack from outside enemies. It was an internal catastrophe, a system failure that cascaded out of control until it consumed the very civilization that had created it. Look at the pattern of destruction again. The most severe damage is concentrated around what archaeologists have identified as the administrative district. This is where you'd expect to find the people who understood the technology, who knew how to operate and maintain the systems that powered their civilization. If something had gone wrong, if the nuclear systems that provided their energy had become unstable, these would be the people trying to fix it. These would be the experts working frantically to prevent a complete meltdown, even as the radiation levels climbed beyond survivable limits. The skeletal remains found in this area tell a story of people who didn't flee when the danger became apparent. They stayed at their posts, trying to contain the disaster even as it killed them. Some of the bodies show evidence of protective gear, primitive hazmat suits made from treated leather and metal mesh. Others appear to have been wearing amulets and talismans that contain materials now known to be effective at absorbing certain types of radiation. They knew what they were dealing with, they understood the danger, and they died trying to prevent something even worse from happening, but they failed. The systems they had built to harness the power of the atom eventually turned against them, releasing forces they could no longer control. The underground channels that had once carried controlled nuclear reactions became conduits for radioactive fire. The workshops that had produced miraculous alloys became sources of deadly contamination. The very technology that had made their civilization possible became the instrument of its destruction. And in the end, the survivors did the only thing they could. They sealed the tunnels, they buried the workshops, they abandoned their great city and scattered to the winds, carrying with them only the memory of what they had lost and the terrible knowledge of why it had to stay lost. The Sanskrit texts preserve their warnings. Knowledge of atomic forces, they wrote, should be guarded more carefully than the most precious treasure. It should be shared only with those proven worthy through generations of wisdom and restraint. And it should never, ever be used unless the very survival of the world depends on it. Because they had learned, at the cost of their entire civilization, that some knowledge carries a price too terrible to pay. The silence of Mohenjo-Daro isn't just the quiet of ruins. It's the silence of a secret that its builders chose to take to their graves rather than risk seeing it misused again. But secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried. And now, 4,000 years later, we've rediscovered the same knowledge that destroyed them. We've built our own nuclear reactors, our own atomic weapons, our own systems for harnessing the binding force that holds matter together. We stand where they once stood, possessed of the same terrible choices. The question that haunts the power, faced with the same impossible empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro, is whether we'll prove wiser than they were, or whether our cities will join theirs as monuments to the dangers of knowledge without wisdom. The atoms we split today release the same energies that once flowed through the tunnels beneath the mound of the dead. The radiation that powers our civilization carries the same risks that ultimately consumed theirs. And somewhere in the radioactive dust of that ancient city, the ghosts of the world's first nuclear engineers are waiting to see if we'll learn from their mistakes, or if we're doomed to repeat them. The deeper you dig into the mystery of Mohenjo-Daro, the more you realize that the conventional timeline of human civilization might be nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Because what if this wasn't the first time humanity had reached these heights? What if it wasn't even the second? Consider the implications of what we've uncovered. A Bronze Age civilization with nuclear technology. Ancient texts describing weapons that match the effects of atomic bombs with disturbing precision. Archaeological evidence of atomic-level destruction in a city that died 4,000 years ago. But here's what really should make you lose sleep at night. If the Indus Valley people had this knowledge, if they built their entire civilization around harnessing atomic energy, then where did they learn it? The Sanskrit texts provide a clue, though it's one that most scholars prefer to ignore. They speak of the Vedas not as human creations, but as eternal knowledge that was heard by ancient sages. Knowledge that existed before humanity, waiting to be rediscovered by those wise enough to listen. The word they use is shruti, which literally means that which is heard. Not invented, not discovered through experimentation, but heard from somewhere else, from someone else. What if the nuclear technology that powered Mohenjo-Daro wasn't developed by the Indus Valley people at all? What if it was taught to them? The archaeological record shows that the Indus Valley Civilization appeared seemingly overnight, fully formed and sophisticated from its earliest layers. There's no gradual development, no primitive phase where they slowly learn to work metal or plan cities. One day there's nothing, and the next day there's a fully operational Bronze Age metropolis with technology that rivals our own. That's not how civilizations usually develop. It's how they develop when someone shows them the shortcuts. And if you're willing to consider that possibility, then you have to ask the next logical question. Who were the teachers? And why did they choose the Indus Valley people to share this knowledge with? The answer might lie in understanding what made this particular civilization unique. Because unlike every other ancient culture we know of, the people of Mohenjo-Daro seem to have been genuinely peaceful. No weapons, no fortifications, no evidence of warfare or conquest. They built a society based on cooperation rather than competition, prosperity rather than power. In other words, they might have been the first human civilization advanced enough to handle nuclear technology responsibly. But as we've seen, even responsible use of atomic energy comes with risks, and perhaps their teachers knew that. Perhaps the entire experiment was designed to fail from the beginning, a test to see if humanity could handle such power without destroying itself. If so, we failed that test catastrophically. The destruction of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just the end of a city, it was the end of humanity's first attempt at a technological civilization. The survivors scattered, carrying with them fragmented memories of what they had lost and hard-earned wisdom about why it had to stay lost. For 4,000 years, that wisdom held. Humanity rebuilt slowly, carefully, following the long path of gradual technological development that we think of as normal. We invented agriculture, then metallurgy, then writing, then engineering, step by careful step over millennia. But now we've caught up with ourselves. We've rediscovered the secrets that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro. We've split the atom, harnessed nuclear energy, built weapons that can end civilization in an afternoon. And the question that haunts the empty streets of the Mound of the Dead is whether we've learned anything from our first attempt. The evidence suggests we haven't. Walk through any modern city and you'll see the same patterns that characterized Mohenjo-Daro, the same obsessive standardization, the same complex infrastructure systems, the same reliance on technology that most people don't understand and can't control. We've built nuclear reactors without fully understanding the long-term consequences of radioactive waste. We've created weapons systems so complex that their own operators sometimes can't predict how they'll behave. We've developed artificial intelligence that may already be beyond our ability to control or comprehend. Just like the Indus Valley people, we've become dependent on systems that could turn against us at any moment. And just like them, we've convinced ourselves that we're wise enough to handle forces that previous generations considered the exclusive province of gods. But there's another parallel that's even more disturbing: the isolation. Mohenjo-Daro existed in relative isolation from the other great civilizations of its time, while Egypt and Mesopotamia were locked in constant warfare, expanding their empires through conquest and domination. The Indus Valley people pursued a different path. They focused on internal development, on perfecting their own society rather than conquering others. That isolation may have been what allowed them to develop nuclear technology in the first place. Without external pressures, without the need to constantly defend themselves or expand their territory, they could focus on pure research, on pushing the boundaries of what was possible, but it also made them vulnerable. When their systems failed, there was no one to help them, no allies to provide assistance, no backup plans involving other civilizations. They rose alone, and they fell alone. We find ourselves in a similar position today. Despite all our talk of globalization and international cooperation, we're essentially alone in the universe as far as we know. If our systems fail, if our technology turns against us, there's no one coming to rescue us. We're conducting the same experiment the Indus Valley people conducted 4,000 years ago, with the same risks and the same potential for catastrophic failure. The only difference is the scale. When Mohenjo-Daro fell, it was a single city. When our civilization falls, it will be the entire planet. The radioactive signatures buried in the ruins of that ancient city aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're a warning written in atomic fire, a message from our own past about the price of technological hubris. But warnings, like prophecies, have a way of ensuring their own fulfillment. Because the more we study what happened at Mohenjo-Daro, the more we understand the forces we're playing with today. And understanding, in this case, might be more dangerous than ignorance. Knowledge of atomic forces, the ancient texts warned, is more destructive than poison or fire. Not because of what it can do to our enemies, but because of what it inevitably does to ourselves. The people who built Mohenjo-Daro learned that lesson the hard way. They paid the ultimate price for their understanding of nuclear physics. And in the end, their greatest achievement wasn't their mastery of atomic energy. It was their decision to take that knowledge to their graves rather than pass it on to a world that wasn't ready for it. But we've rediscovered it anyway. We've rebuilt their reactors, recreated their weapons, and convinced ourselves that we're wiser than they were, that we can handle what they couldn't. The silence of the Mound of the Dead suggests otherwise. As night falls over the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, the residual radiation in the ancient bricks creates a faint glow that's invisible to the naked eye, but detectable by sensitive instruments. It's a ghostly phosphorescence that has persisted for 40 centuries, a reminder that some fires, once lit, never truly go out. That glow is our inheritance. The legacy of humanity's first nuclear age, preserved in stone and shadow as a warning for those wise enough to read it. The question is whether we'll heed that warning, or whether we're destined to add our own cities to the growing catalogue of places where the atoms dance and the silence stretches on forever. In the end, perhaps that's what makes Mohenjo-Daro so terrifying. It's not just a ruin, it's a preview, a glimpse of our own possible future, written in radioactive dust and melted stone. The Mound of the Dead has been waiting 4,000 years for us to return to this moment. The moment when we have to choose between wisdom and knowledge, between restraint and power. The atoms we split today are the same atoms they split millennia ago. The choice we face is the same choice they faced, and their silence is the sound of humanity's first wrong answer, echoing across the centuries like the half-life of atomic decay. The only question now is whether we'll prove capable of a different choice, or whether the archaeologists of some distant future will puzzle over the radioactive ruins of our own great cities, wondering what we knew and why we chose to use it anyway. The night wind blows across the empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro, carrying with it the whispered warnings of the dead. But in our laboratories and weapons facilities, in our power plants and research centers, the machinery of atomic fire hums on, indifferent to the lessons written in a radioactive stone. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be ungained. Some choices once made cannot be unmade. And some silences speak louder than words. The morning after a nuclear detonation, if you survive the initial blast, you notice something strange about the silence. It's not just quiet. It's empty, as if sound itself has been burned away. The birds don't sing because there are no birds left to sing. The insects don't buzz because the radiation has sterilized everything down to the microscopic level. That same quality of emptiness hangs over Mohenjo-Daro today, 4,000 years after whatever happened there. But there's something else in that silence, something that makes even the most skeptical archaeologists uncomfortable when they work the site alone. It's the feeling that something is still happening. Dr. Michael Cremo, a researcher who spent years documenting anomalous archaeological evidence, discovered something in the 1990s that the mainstream academic community has largely ignored. While examining storage rooms filled with artifacts from early Mohenjo-Daro excavations, he found items that had never been properly catalogued or studied. Among them was a collection of small clay tablets covered in script that didn't match any known Indus Valley writing. The symbols were cruder, more hastily made, as if carved by people working under extreme stress. When these tablets were finally subjected to linguistic analysis, researchers made a disturbing discovery. The script wasn't random. It followed patterns consistent with emergency communications, the kind of abbreviated notation systems used when time is running out, and every second counts. Modern military communications use similar compressed formats during crisis situations. But these tablets were 4,000 years old. Someone at Mohenjo-Daro had been sending urgent messages right up until the moment the city died. Messages written in a panic, in a script so abbreviated that even now we can only guess at their meaning. but the tone comes through clearly across the millennia. These weren't routine administrative records or religious texts. These were warnings. One tablet, when subjected to spectrographic analysis, showed traces of materials that shouldn't exist in Bronze Age contexts. Specifically, it contained isotopes of carbon that are produced only in high-energy nuclear reactions. The clay had been fired in the presence of intense radiation, baked not in a kiln, but in the flash of atomic fire. This suggests that someone was still writing, still trying to communicate, even as the nuclear disaster was unfolding around them. Even as the very atoms in the air were being transformed by forces beyond their control. What were they trying to say? Who were they trying to warn? The answer might lie in understanding the broader context of what was happening in the ancient world around 1900 BCE. Because Mohenjo-Daro wasn't the only civilization to meet a sudden catastrophic end during this period. Across the globe, advanced Bronze Age cultures were collapsing with startling synchronicity. The Minoan civilization on Crete disappeared overnight, leaving behind palaces that showed signs of having been abandoned mid-task. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed so completely that their capital city wasn't rediscovered until the 20th century. Even Egypt, normally the most stable of ancient civilizations, went through a period of chaos and social collapse known as the First Intermediate Period. Traditional historians attribute this to climate change, the so-called 4.2 kiloyear event that brought drought and famine to much of the ancient world. But climate change doesn't explain the specific pattern of destruction we see at sites like Mohenjo-Daro. It doesn't account for the radiation signatures, the vitrified materials, the evidence of atomic-level forces at work. What if the collapse of Bronze Age civilization wasn't caused by climate change at all? What if it was caused by the same thing that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro, repeated across multiple sites around the world? The Sanskrit texts describe exactly such a scenario. They speak of a great war fought not just between kingdoms, but between different approaches to understanding reality itself. The Mahabharata calls it the war to end all wars, a conflict so devastating that it reset the entire course of human history. According to these accounts, the war began when certain groups gained access to weapons of unimaginable power. Not just nuclear weapons, but devices that could manipulate the fundamental forces that hold reality together. The texts describe weapons that could destroy the three worlds, devices that could unravel the very fabric of space and time. At first, these weapons were used sparingly, deployed only against military targets in carefully controlled ways. But as the conflict escalated, restraint gave way to desperation. Cities were targeted, civilian populations were annihilated, entire regions were rendered uninhabitable for generations. The descriptions match archaeological evidence from sites around the world. In Scotland, the vitrified hill forts show signs of having been subjected to temperatures that turned stone to glass. In Ireland, certain ancient monuments contain materials with isotopic signatures that suggest nuclear processes. Even in South America, some pre-Columbian sites show evidence of exposure to extreme heat and radiation. It's as if someone had conducted a global nuclear war using weapons far more sophisticated than anything we possess today. Weapons that could target specific cities with surgical precision while leaving surrounding areas largely untouched. But who were the combatants in this ancient war, and why did they choose to fight it? The answer might lie in understanding what the Indus Valley Civilization actually represented, because the more we study their society, the more it becomes clear that they had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created a technological civilization without the usual pathologies of power and domination. No weapons, no armies, no evidence of conquest or exploitation, no monuments to individual rulers, no hoarding of wealth by elites. They had somehow managed to organize a complex society around principles of cooperation and shared prosperity rather than competition and control. In other words, they had solved the fundamental problem that has plagued every human civilization since the dawn of recorded history. They had figured out how to have nice things without becoming monsters in the process. That achievement would have been seen as profoundly threatening by the more traditional civilizations of their time. Egypt and Mesopotamia were built on the principle that social order required hierarchy, that prosperity required exploitation, that peace could only be maintained through the threat of violence. The existence of the Indus Valley Civilization proved that alternative was possible, and that made it incredibly dangerous to the established order. Think about what would happen today if someone discovered a way to organize society that eliminated poverty, war, and environmental destruction while maintaining technological advancement and individual freedom. How long do you think it would take for existing power structures to find reasons why such a system needed to be stopped? The ancient world was no different. The peaceful prosperity of Mohenjo-Daro and its sister cities represented an existential threat to civilizations built on domination and control. As long as the Indus Valley alternative existed, it would serve as a constant reminder that things could be different, that the suffering and oppression that characterized other societies wasn't inevitable, so they destroyed it. Not through conventional warfare, which the Indus Valley people might have been able to resist through their superior technology, but through weapons so devastating that resistance was impossible. The nuclear destruction of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just an act of war, it was an act of ideological cleansing, an attempt to erase not just a civilization, but the very idea that civilization could be organized differently. And it worked. The destruction was so complete, so traumatic, that the survivors carried with them not just physical scars, but psychological ones. The knowledge that had made their peaceful society possible became associated with ultimate destruction. The technology that had powered their prosperity became synonymous with apocalypse. The Sanskrit texts preserve this trauma in their warnings about the dangers of atomic knowledge, but they also preserve something else: the memory of what had been lost. Hidden within the mythological language are technical descriptions of the weapons that destroyed the ancient world, detailed enough that modern nuclear engineers can recognize familiar processes and effects. It's as if the survivors deliberately encoded the information needed to rebuild their lost technology, while simultaneously warning about the catastrophic consequences of using it. They wanted future generations to understand what had been destroyed, but they also wanted to make sure that future generations would think very carefully before rebuilding it. But human nature being what it is, we focused on the technical details and ignored the warnings. We've reconstructed the atomic physics that powered Mohenjo-Daro, built weapons that matched the descriptions in ancient texts, and convinced ourselves that we're somehow wiser than the civilizations that came before us. The evidence suggests otherwise. Look at how we've chosen to organize our modern technological civilization. Despite having access to unprecedented wealth and knowledge, we've created a world characterized by the same competition, exploitation, and domination that defined the ancient civilizations that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro. We could have chosen the Indus Valley path. We could have built our advanced technology around principles of cooperation and shared prosperity. Instead, we've built it around the same power structures that have characterized human civilization since the Bronze Age collapse. And just like those ancient civilizations, we've developed weapons that could destroy not just our enemies, but the entire world. We've created systems so complex and interconnected that a single failure could cascade into global catastrophe. We've made ourselves dependent on technologies that we don't fully understand and can't completely control. In other words, we've set ourselves up for the same kind of catastrophic failure that destroyed the first technological civilization. The only difference is the scale. When Mohenjo-Daro fell, it was one city in a world full of other possibilities. When our civilization falls, there won't be anywhere else to go. The radioactive dust of the Mound of the Dead isn't just archaeological evidence, it's a mirror, reflecting our own choices back at us across 4,000 years. The silence that hangs over those ancient streets isn't just the quiet of abandonment. It's the sound of consequences, waiting patiently for us to repeat the same mistakes. But perhaps that's too pessimistic. Perhaps we can learn from the past instead of being condemned to repeat it. Perhaps the warnings encoded in those ancient texts will prove more powerful than the technical knowledge they contain. The question is whether we'll make that choice before it's too late, or whether the archaeologists of some distant future will puzzle over the radioactive ruins of New York and London and Tokyo, wondering what we knew and why we chose to use it anyway. Because the atoms we split today are the same atoms they split millennia ago. The forces we've unleashed are the same forces that turned Mohenjo-Daro into a monument to the dangers of knowledge without wisdom. And the silence that waits at the end of every nuclear chain reaction is the same silence that has been waiting for us in the empty streets of the Mound of the Dead for 4,000 years. Some stories don't have endings. They just have repetitions, playing out across the centuries, like the half-life of radioactive decay. The story of Mohenjo-Daro is our story, told in advance, written in melted stone and atomic fire as a warning for those wise enough to read it. The only question now is whether we'll prove capable of writing a different ending, or whether we're destined to become just another chapter in the long, sad history of civilizations that reached for the power of gods and burned themselves to ash in the process. The night wind still blows across the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, carrying with it the whispered warnings of the dead. And somewhere in our laboratories and weapons facilities, in our power plants and research centers, the same atomic fires that once powered that ancient civilization continue to burn, waiting patiently for their moment to dance once more across the surface of the world. The choice, as always, is ours, but the consequences, like the radiation signatures buried in ancient brick, will persist long after we're gone, speaking to future generations in the universal language of atomic decay about the price of power and the weight of knowledge. In the end, that may be Mohenjo-Daro's greatest gift to humanity. Not answers, but questions. Not solutions, but warnings. Not certainty, but the terrible responsibility that comes with understanding just how much we have to lose. The Mound of the Dead stands silent under the stars, holding its secrets and its warnings in equal measure. The atoms that dance within its radioactive bricks are the same atoms that power our world today, carrying within them the same potential for creation and destruction that has characterized the human story since we first learned to split the forces that bind matter together. And in that silence, in that persistence, in that eternal atomic dance, lies perhaps the most important truth of all. Some knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten. Some choices, once available, cannot be ignored. The question that echoes across 4,000 years from the empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro is whether we'll prove wise enough to handle that knowledge, or whether we're doomed to join that ancient city in the long catalogue of civilizations that reached too high and fell too far. The atoms are waiting. The choice is ours. And time, like radioactive decay, moves only in one direction. The evidence keeps mounting, piece by disturbing piece, like radiation accumulating in bone marrow. Because what we haven't discussed yet is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Mohenjo-Daro mystery, the precision of the destruction. When nuclear weapons detonate, they don't just destroy randomly. The pattern of devastation follows predictable physics. There's a ground zero where the most intense damage occurs, radiating outward in concentric circles of decreasing destruction. Buildings closest to the epicenter are vaporized. Those further away show heat damage. At the periphery, structures remain largely intact, but may show signs of blast effects or radiation exposure. This is exactly what we see at Mohenjo-Daro. Dr. David Davenport's mapping of the destruction pattern revealed something that should be impossible for a Bronze Age site. The heat damage radiates outward from a central point with mathematical precision. The most severe vitrification occurs within a roughly circular area, about 150 feet in diameter. Beyond that, the damage decreases in intensity, following the exact curve you'd expect from an aerial nuclear detonation. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. The epicenter isn't random. It's positioned directly over what would have been the city's administrative heart, the area where the most important buildings and presumably the most knowledgeable people would have been located. This wasn't a stray weapon or an accidental detonation. This was a targeted strike, aimed with surgical precision at the brain center of Indus Valley Civilization. Think about what that means. Someone, 4,000 years ago, possessed not only nuclear weapons but delivery systems accurate enough to hit a specific district within a city. They had the technology to calculate blast effects, to position their weapon at the optimal altitude for maximum destruction, to ensure that their target would be completely eliminated while minimizing damage to surrounding areas. This level of precision suggests military technology that rivals our own modern capabilities. Guidance systems, targeting computers, weapons platforms sophisticated enough to deliver atomic warheads with pinpoint accuracy across potentially vast distances. Who had such technology in 2500 BCE? And why have we found no trace of the civilization that created it? Unless, of course, we're looking at it backwards. Unless the destroyers weren't some unknown ancient enemy, but the destroyed themselves. Consider this possibility. What if Mohenjo-Daro wasn't attacked by outside forces, but destroyed from within? What if the Indus Valley people had developed nuclear weapons as well as nuclear power? And what we're seeing is the result of those weapons being turned against their own city. The idea sounds insane until you start examining the evidence for internal conflict within the Indus Valley Civilization. Because despite their reputation for peace and cooperation, there are subtle signs that all was not well in their society during the final period. The later archaeological layers at Mohenjo-Daro show increasing signs of stress. Building quality declined. The obsessive standardization that characterized earlier periods began to break down. Some structures appear to have been hastily reinforced or modified, as if people were preparing for some kind of threat. More tellingly, the distribution of certain artifacts changes dramatically in the final layers. Items that had once been common throughout the city become concentrated in specific areas, as if resources were being hoarded by particular groups. The egalitarian society that had characterized the Indus Valley Civilization for centuries appears to have developed significant inequalities shortly before its end. What could cause such rapid social breakdown in a civilization that had maintained stability for over 1,000 years? The answer might lie in the very technology that had made their prosperity possible, because nuclear power, for all its benefits, comes with risks that extend far beyond the immediate danger of radiation. It centralizes tremendous power in the hands of those who control it. It requires specialized knowledge that only a small elite can possess, and it creates weapons that can tip the balance of power so dramatically that the temptation to use them becomes almost irresistible. Perhaps the peaceful cooperative society of the Indus Valley began to fracture when some group gained exclusive control over nuclear technology. Perhaps what we're seeing at Mohenjo-Daro is the result of an ancient nuclear civil war fought between different factions within the same civilization. The precision of the targeting supports this theory. An outside enemy might have simply tried to destroy the entire city, but internal enemies would have known exactly where to strike for maximum effect. They would have known which buildings housed the technology they wanted to capture or destroy. They would have known which areas contained the people whose knowledge they feared. The Sanskrit texts hint at exactly this scenario. The Mahabharata doesn't just describe wars between different kingdoms. It describes conflicts within families, brother fighting brother, using weapons that could destroy the world. The epic's central tragedy is that the knowledge of ultimate weapons falls into the hands of people who aren't wise enough to resist using them, even against their own kin. But whether the destruction came from within or without, the result was the same: the sudden catastrophic end of humanity's first nuclear civilization, leaving behind only radioactive ruins and ancient warnings about the price of atomic knowledge. And now we find ourselves in a remarkably similar position. We've developed nuclear weapons far more powerful than anything that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro. We've built delivery systems that can strike any target on Earth with precision that would have seemed miraculous to ancient peoples. We've created arsenals capable of ending human civilization multiple times over. And just like the Indus Valley Civilization in its final period, we're showing signs of increasing social stress and breakdown. The cooperative international order that emerged after World War II is fracturing. Nuclear weapons are proliferating to new actors. The specialized knowledge needed to build and maintain these weapons is spreading beyond the control of traditional nuclear powers. We're approaching the same crossroads that faced Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago. The same choice between wisdom and power, between restraint and the temptation to use ultimate weapons to solve immediate problems. The archaeological evidence suggests that ancient humanity failed that test catastrophically. The question is whether we'll prove capable of making a different choice. But there's another layer to this mystery that goes beyond nuclear weapons and ancient civilizations. Because the more you study the evidence from Mohenjo-Daro, the more you realize that we might be dealing with something even stranger than atomic warfare. Consider the isotopic signatures found in the ruins. While some match known products of nuclear fission, others don't correspond to any process we understand. There are trace elements present that shouldn't exist in nature. Isotopes that would require particle accelerators or other advanced technologies to create. More puzzling are the magnetic anomalies scattered throughout the site. Certain areas show evidence of having been exposed to magnetic fields thousands of times stronger than Earth's natural magnetism, fields so intense they would require technology we're only beginning to develop today. And then there are the crystalline structures found embedded in some of the vitrified bricks. Under electron microscope analysis, these crystals display properties that shouldn't be possible in materials created by conventional nuclear explosions. They appear to have been formed under conditions of extreme pressure and electromagnetic field strength that we can barely reproduce in our most advanced laboratories. What kind of weapons could produce such effects? What technology could generate magnetic fields of such intensity while simultaneously triggering nuclear reactions? The answer might lie in understanding what the Sanskrit texts mean when they describe weapons that could destroy the three worlds. Perhaps they weren't talking about nuclear weapons at all, but about something far more exotic. Devices that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself. Modern physics has begun to explore the possibility of weapons based on exotic matter, antimatter reactions, or the manipulation of space-time itself. Technologies that could theoretically produce effects far beyond conventional nuclear weapons. The magnetic anomalies and strange isotopic signatures at Mohenjo-Daro might be evidence that such technologies were already being developed 4,000 years ago. But if that's true, it raises even more disturbing questions. Because such technologies would require scientific understanding far beyond what we assume ancient peoples possessed. They would need knowledge of particle physics, quantum mechanics, and relativistic effects that we've only discovered in the last century. Where could they have learned such things? How could Bronze Age peoples have developed technologies that challenge our modern understanding of physics? Unless, of course, they didn't develop them. Unless they learned them from someone else. The possibility that haunts the empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro is that we're not looking at the achievements of ancient human civilization at all. We're looking at the aftermath of contact with something beyond human understanding. Something that shared knowledge too advanced for humanity to handle responsibly. The patterns of destruction, the precision of the targeting, the exotic technologies implied by the physical evidence. All of it suggests intervention by intelligences far more advanced than anything that should have existed on Earth 4,000 years ago. But if that's true, it means that the warnings encoded in ancient texts aren't just about the dangers of nuclear weapons. They're about the dangers of knowledge itself, regardless of its source. They're warnings about what happens when any civilization, human or otherwise, gains access to technologies that exceed their wisdom to use them safely. And that brings us back to our own situation. Because we too have been recipients of knowledge that seems to advance faster than our ability to handle it responsibly. The pace of technological development in the last century has been unprecedented in human history. We've gone from horse-drawn carriages to nuclear weapons, from telegraph wires to global internet, from basic chemistry to genetic engineering in the span of a few generations. Where is all this knowledge coming from? How are we making discoveries at a rate that defies the normal pace of human learning? Perhaps we're not the first recipients of such rapid technological advancement. Perhaps the same forces that once shared atomic secrets with the builders of Mohenjo-Daro are sharing even more advanced knowledge with us today. The question is whether we'll prove any wiser than our ancient predecessors, whether we'll learn to use these gifts responsibly, or whether our cities will join Mohenjo-Daro in the growing catalogue of civilizations that reached too high too fast and paid the ultimate price. The silence that hangs over the mound of the dead isn't just the quiet of ancient ruins. It's the sound of a test failed, a warning unheeded, a civilization that thought it could handle forces beyond its comprehension. And as we stand at the threshold of technologies that could remake or destroy our world, that silence feels less like history and more like prophecy. The atoms we split, the genes we splice, the artificial intelligences we create, all of them carry the same potential for creation and destruction that once flowed through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro. The difference is that this time, there's nowhere it will be absolute and final else to go. This time, when the silence falls, the radioactive dust of that ancient city whispers across 4 millennia, carrying with it the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences faced. And somewhere in that whisper is the most important message of all. That knowledge without wisdom is not progress, but peril. And that some gifts come with prices too terrible to pay. The night deepens over Mohenjo-Daro, and the ancient stones continue their slow atomic dance, measuring out the half-lives of elements that shouldn't exist in nature, waiting patiently for humanity to decide whether it will learn from the past or become part of it. The choice, as always, is ours. But the consequences, like the radiation buried in those ancient bricks, will persist long after we're gone, speaking in the universal language of atomic decay about the price of reaching for the power of gods. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting epitaph for any civilization. Not what it achieved, but what it chose not to use. Not what it built, but what it had the wisdom to leave unbuilt. The Mound of the Dead stands as a monument to a choice made long ago, when knowledge met wisdom and wisdom lost. The question that echoes across the centuries is whether we'll find the strength to make a different choice, or whether our epitaph will be written in the same radioactive script that marks the graves of civilizations that came before. Some silences speak louder than words. Some warnings are written in stone and fire, and some lessons are paid for with the ultimate price, in the hope that someone, somewhere, will finally learn to listen. The atoms are patient. The choice is urgent, and time, like the half-life of atomic decay, moves only in one direction, carrying us inexorably toward the same crossroads that faced Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago. The silence is waiting. The question is whether we'll join it, or find the wisdom to choose a different ending to the same ancient story. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came not from the main excavation sites, but from the peripheral areas that archaeologists rarely discuss in public forums. In 1967, a team working on drainage systems uncovered what they initially catalogued as a ceremonial chamber. It was a circular room, roughly 12 feet in diameter, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the city. The walls of this chamber told a story that made even seasoned researchers uncomfortable. They were covered in symbols, but not the standardized Indus script found elsewhere. These were different, crude, desperate, carved with tools that had scraped and gouged the stone, as if the artists were working in darkness or under extreme stress. More disturbing was what lay at the center of the chamber, a depression in the floor, perfectly circular, lined with a material that analysis revealed to be unlike anything found elsewhere in the ancient world. It wasn't clay or stone or metal. Under spectroscopic examination, it showed properties consistent with materials that had been subjected to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius, while simultaneously being bombarded with high-energy particles. The depression was empty when discovered, but traces remained. Residues that shouldn't exist. Microscopic fragments that contained isotopic ratios matching elements created in modern particle accelerators. Elements that have half-lives so brief they decay within hours of being formed. Whatever had once been contained in that chamber had been removed long ago, but its atomic signature lingered like a ghost in the stone. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a nuclear archaeologist who studied the chamber in the 1980s, made an observation that still gives researchers pause. The symbols carved into the walls weren't random. They followed patterns consistent with technical diagrams, as if someone had been trying to document a process or procedure, but the execution grew increasingly erratic toward the bottom of the walls, the symbols becoming more hurried, more desperate. It was as if whoever had been working in that chamber had been racing against time, trying to record critical information before something irreversible occurred. Morrison's team found evidence that the chamber had been sealed deliberately. Heavy stone blocks had been moved into position to close the entrance, and the gaps had been filled with a mortar that contained unusual additives. Materials that modern analysis suggests were specifically chosen for their ability to absorb and contain radiation. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that whatever had happened in that chamber would stay buried. But the most chilling discovery came when researchers examined the skeletons found in nearby areas. Several showed signs of having been exposed to neutron radiation in the hours before death. Their bone marrow had been destroyed by high-energy particles, causing a specific type of cellular damage that medical science didn't understand until the atomic age. These weren't people who had died in the initial catastrophe. These were survivors who had lived long enough after the event to develop acute radiation syndrome. People who had watched their hair fall out, their skin blister, their bodies slowly shut down as their cells stopped dividing and their organs began to fail. The Sanskrit texts describe exactly these symptoms. They speak of a sickness that comes after exposure to the divine weapons, a wasting disease that begins with burning skin and ends with death from within. They describe people whose bodies seem to rot while they still live, whose children are born malformed or not at all. These aren't metaphors or mythological exaggerations. They're clinical descriptions of radiation sickness, written by people who had witnessed its effects firsthand. But there's something else in those ancient accounts that modern researchers find deeply troubling. The texts don't just describe the immediate effects of atomic weapons. They describe the long-term consequences, the way the poisoned earth refuses to heal, the way the sickness passes from parent to child across generations. They speak of cursed bloodlines, families marked by exposure to divine fire whose descendants suffer mysterious ailments for generations. Modern genetics recognizes these descriptions as evidence of radiation-induced mutations, genetic damage that persists across multiple generations before finally being diluted by the larger gene pool. Archaeological genetics has begun to trace these ancient bloodlines through DNA analysis of skeletal remains found throughout the region. What they've discovered challenges our understanding of how quickly human populations recover from catastrophic events. Certain genetic markers associated with radiation exposure appear in skeletal remains from sites across the Indus Valley, but with a curious distribution. The markers are most concentrated in remains from the immediate post-collapse period, as you'd expect. But they persist at detectable levels in populations living hundreds of miles from Mohenjo-Daro, and they show up in genetic lineages that continued for centuries after the city's destruction. It's as if the atomic fire that consumed Mohenjo-Daro had scattered its poison across vast distances, contaminating bloodlines throughout the subcontinent. The genetic echo of that ancient catastrophe may still be detectable in certain populations today, a molecular memory of humanity's first nuclear age preserved in the very structure of our DNA. This raises disturbing questions about the true scope of what happened 4,000 years ago. If the destruction had been limited to Mohenjo-Daro itself, we wouldn't expect to see such widespread genetic evidence. The contamination patterns suggest something far more extensive, a series of atomic detonations that affected multiple population centers across a region the size of modern-day Europe. The Sanskrit epics support this interpretation. The Mahabharata doesn't describe a single battle or isolated incident. It describes a global war, a conflict that raged across the known world, using weapons that could poison the earth itself. The text speaks of entire kingdoms being rendered uninhabitable, of fertile lands turned to wasteland that would remain barren for generations. Archaeological evidence from other Bronze Age sites begins to make sense in this context. The sudden collapse of the Hittite Empire, the mysterious abandonment of advanced settlements throughout Central Asia, the inexplicable gaps in the archaeological record that coincide with the end of the Indus Valley Civilization. What if these weren't separate events, but casualties of the same global conflict? What if the ancient world experienced something equivalent to nuclear winter, a catastrophic disruption of climate and agriculture caused by multiple atomic detonations? Ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica shows evidence of unusual atmospheric conditions around 1900 BCE. Elevated levels of exotic isotopes that shouldn't exist in natural ice. Sulfur compounds that suggest massive atmospheric disturbances. Temperature fluctuations that indicate sudden, dramatic changes in global weather patterns. The ice preserves a record of the ancient atmosphere, and that record speaks of fire and ash on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded history. Not the gradual climate change that scientists initially blamed for the Bronze Age collapse, but sudden, violent atmospheric disruption consistent with multiple nuclear detonations. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the genetic analysis of modern populations, because the mutations associated with ancient radiation exposure haven't completely disappeared. They've been diluted by thousands of years of interbreeding, but they're still there, embedded in the genome like molecular scars. Certain populations, particularly those descended from refugees who fled the Indus Valley during the collapse, show higher than normal rates of specific genetic disorders, cancers that cluster in particular family lines, neurological conditions that appear across generations, fertility problems that persist despite modern medical intervention. The medical community has struggled to explain these patterns, attributing them to environmental factors or genetic bottlenecks caused by ancient population movements. But when viewed in the context of the Mohenjo-Daro evidence, a different picture emerges. We may be looking at the genetic legacy of humanity's first nuclear war, still playing out in the DNA of people whose ancestors survived the atomic fire that consumed the ancient world. The descendants of those who fled Mohenjo-Daro carry within their cells the molecular memory of that catastrophe, a genetic warning written in the language of mutation and disease. And if that's true, it means that the consequences of ancient atomic warfare are still with us, still affecting lives, still extracting a price from humanity 4,000 years after the weapons fell silent. The silence of Mohenjo-Daro isn't just historical, it's biological, encoded in the very structure of life itself, passed down through generations like an inheritance no one wanted to receive. Modern genetic research has begun to map these ancient mutations with unprecedented precision, tracing the flow of damaged DNA through family lines that stretch back to the Bronze Age collapse. What they're finding suggests that the atomic catastrophe that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro may have affected human evolution itself, creating genetic variations that persist to this day. Some of these mutations appear to confer resistance to radiation exposure, as if the survivors of the ancient catastrophe underwent rapid evolutionary adaptation to a contaminated environment. Other mutations seem to affect brain chemistry, potentially influencing how their descendants process fear, aggression, and social bonding. It's possible that the psychological traits that have characterized human civilization since the Bronze Age collapse, our tendency toward warfare and domination, our difficulty maintaining the kind of cooperative societies that the Indus Valley people achieved, may themselves be the genetic legacy of atomic trauma. We may not just be the inheritors of the technology that destroyed Mohenjo-Daro. We may be the biological products of that destruction, shaped at the cellular level by forces our ancestors unleashed 4,000 years ago. The radioactive dust of the Mound of the Dead doesn't just contaminate the soil, it contaminates the future, reaching across millennia to influence the very nature of what it means to be human. And as we stand on the brink of our own atomic age, facing the same choices that confronted our ancient predecessors, we carry within ourselves the molecular memory of what happens when those choices go wrong. The atoms that dance in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro are the same atoms that flow through our blood today. The radiation that poisoned that ancient city may still be shaping our thoughts, our fears, our fundamental understanding of what we're capable of doing to each other and ourselves. In the end, perhaps that's the most profound legacy of humanity's first nuclear civilization. Not just the archaeological evidence of what they achieved and how they fell, but the biological transformation of our species itself, written in genetic code and passed down through generations, like an unbreakable chain connecting us to that moment when the atoms first danced in deadly harmony above the streets of the Mound of the Dead. The silence isn't just in the ruins, it's in our DNA, waiting to speak its warning in the language of mutation and memory, reminding us that some choices echo not just through history, but through the very structure of life itself. The warning signs were there if anyone had bothered to look. But who looks for nuclear fallout in Bronze Age pottery? Who thinks to test ancient beads for isotopic contamination? The evidence sat in museum storage rooms for decades, carefully catalogued and quietly ignored, waiting for science to catch up with archaeology. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers began to understand what they were really looking at. Advanced spectroscopy revealed the truth hiding in plain sight. Jewelry that glowed faintly under certain conditions. Pottery glazes that contained elements that shouldn't exist in nature. Trade goods that carried atomic signatures across thousands of miles of ancient commerce routes. The Indus Valley people weren't just victims of nuclear technology, they were exporters of it. Think about what that means for our understanding of the ancient world. We've always assumed that Bronze Age trade networks dealt in mundane goods, copper and tin for making bronze, precious stones for decoration, spices and textiles for luxury markets. But what if they were also trading in something far more exotic? What if atomic materials were flowing through ancient commerce networks like oil flows through modern pipelines? The evidence is scattered across museum collections worldwide, hiding in plain sight among artifacts that no one thought to examine closely. A carnelian bead from Mesopotamia that contains trace isotopes matching those found at Mohenjo-Daro. A bronze mirror from Egypt with unusual elemental compositions. Pottery shards from as far away as the Mediterranean that show signs of exposure to high-energy radiation. These aren't random contamination events. They follow the known trade routes that connected the Indus Valley to the rest of the ancient world. As if radioactive materials were being deliberately packaged and shipped to distant markets, carrying their atomic signatures like invisible cargo manifests. But who was buying? And what were they planning to do with materials that could kill through simple proximity? The answer might lie in understanding how ancient peoples would have perceived such substances. Without knowledge of atomic physics, they wouldn't have understood radiation as we do. They would have interpreted the effects as something else entirely, something magical. Materials that glowed in darkness, substances that could sicken enemies from a distance, objects that seemed to possess supernatural power, affecting the health and fortune of those who possessed them. In a world where the line between science and sorcery hadn't yet been drawn, radioactive materials would have been the ultimate magical ingredients. The Sanskrit texts support this interpretation. They describe not just weapons of mass destruction, but smaller applications of atomic knowledge. Amulets that could protect or curse. Powders that could heal or poison depending on how they were used. Substances so potent that even handling them required elaborate rituals and protective ceremonies. These weren't metaphors. They were safety protocols, developed by people who had learned through bitter experience that certain materials demanded respect and careful handling. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the ancient world begins to make sense when viewed through this lens. Burial goods that show signs of radioactive decay, temple offerings that contain isotopic anomalies, sacred objects that were clearly handled with elaborate precautions, wrapped in materials designed to provide shielding. The priests and shamans of the ancient world may have been the first nuclear technicians, developing religious rituals around the safe handling of materials they didn't scientifically understand, but knew were dangerous. And what happens when such materials fall into the wrong hands? When someone decides that the power contained in these atomic substances should be concentrated, weaponized, used not for protection or healing, but for conquest and control. The destruction of Mohenjo-Daro may have been the result of exactly such a decision. Someone, somewhere, decided that the peaceful Indus Valley Civilization had become too powerful, too prosperous, too much of a threat to the established order, and they used the very materials that the Indus people had been trading to destroy the source. It would have been poetic justice of the most horrific kind. A civilization destroyed by its own exports, consumed by the atomic fire that they had helped spread throughout the ancient world. But the story doesn't end there, because the trade networks that had carried these materials before the catastrophe didn't simply disappear. They adapted, evolved, went underground. The knowledge of atomic substances and their effects was too valuable to abandon completely. Evidence suggests that certain mystery cults and secret societies that emerged in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse were built around the preservation of this dangerous knowledge. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the mystery schools of Egypt, the secretive practices of certain Vedic traditions in India. All of them share common elements that make more sense when viewed as nuclear safety protocols disguised as religious ritual. Elaborate purification ceremonies that resemble decontamination procedures. Hierarchical initiation systems that controlled access to dangerous knowledge. Oaths of secrecy that carried penalties severe enough to ensure compliance. These weren't just spiritual organizations. They were the ancient world's equivalent of nuclear regulatory agencies, groups dedicated to ensuring that atomic knowledge was preserved, but never again used on the scale that had destroyed Mohenjo-Daro. The Greek philosophers spoke of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and being punished for eternity. The Egyptians told stories of knowledge so dangerous that it had to be hidden in tombs and temples where only the worthy could access it. The Vedic tradition developed elaborate codes and ciphers to disguise technical information as religious verse. All of them were dealing with the same fundamental problem. How do you preserve knowledge that could save humanity while preventing its misuse by those who would destroy the world to rule over its ashes? The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. They embedded the information in stories, myths, and religious practices that would be passed down through generations, but they encoded it in ways that would only be comprehensible to those who already possessed the scientific knowledge needed to understand its true meaning. It was a time lock mechanism built from culture itself. The knowledge would be preserved, but it would remain inaccessible until humanity developed the wisdom needed to handle it responsibly. Unfortunately, that plan may have worked too well. By the time we rediscovered atomic physics in the 20th century, we had forgotten that the knowledge had ever existed before. We thought we were pioneers, exploring uncharted scientific territory for the first time in human history. We missed the warnings embedded in our own cultural heritage. The myths and stories that should have cautioned us about the dangers of atomic power were dismissed as primitive superstition. The religious traditions that had preserved safety protocols were ignored as irrelevant to modern science. And so we repeated the same mistakes that had destroyed Mohenjo-Daro, building weapons of incredible power without the cultural framework needed to prevent their misuse. The secret societies and mystery schools that had once guarded atomic knowledge began to emerge from the shadows in the 20th century, trying desperately to share the warnings they had preserved for millennia. But their language of symbols and metaphors was incomprehensible to scientists trained in empirical methodology. The very encoding mechanisms that had protected the knowledge from misuse for thousands of years now prevented its wisdom from being understood by those who needed it most. Some researchers have suggested that certain government agencies and military organizations have had access to these ancient warnings all along, that the rapid development of nuclear technology in the mid-20th century wasn't entirely the result of scientific breakthrough, but included information retrieved from archaeological sites and ancient texts. If true, it would explain some of the puzzling aspects of the Manhattan Project, the speed with which complex theoretical problems were solved, the apparent familiarity that some researchers showed with processes that should have been completely novel, the specific design choices that seemed to echo descriptions found in Sanskrit texts. But it would also explain why such information was classified at the highest levels, and why access to certain archaeological sites has been restricted since the development of nuclear weapons. Because if ancient humanity had already walked this path and paid this price, if the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro were evidence of what happens when atomic knowledge is misused, then modern governments would face an impossible choice. Share the information and risk panic about the cyclical nature of civilization's rise and fall, or keep it secret and risk repeating the same catastrophic mistakes that had destroyed the ancient world. The evidence suggests they chose secrecy, archaeological expeditions that suddenly lost funding when they uncovered inconvenient evidence, research papers that were classified before publication, artifacts that disappeared into government storage facilities, never to be seen again. The silence surrounding Mohenjo-Daro isn't just academic caution. It's active suppression of information too dangerous for public consumption. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially when they're written in atomic fire and embedded in the very stones of ancient cities. The truth about humanity's nuclear past is scattered across the archaeological record, waiting for those brave enough or foolish enough to piece it together. And as our own atomic age reaches the same critical juncture that faced the builders of Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago, that truth becomes more urgent with every passing day. We stand at the same crossroads they faced, the same choice between wisdom and power, between restraint and the terrible temptation to use ultimate weapons to solve immediate problems. The same decision that will determine whether our cities join theirs as radioactive monuments to the price of knowledge without conscience. The atoms we split today are the same atoms they split millennia ago. The forces we've unleashed are the same forces that turned their great civilization into the mound of the dead. And the silence that waits at the end of every nuclear chain reaction is the same silence that has been calling to us from those empty streets for 4,000 years. Some choices echo across eternity. Some warnings are written in languages that transcend time and culture. And some lessons are paid for with prices so terrible that they burn themselves into the very structure of reality, waiting patiently for the next civilization to reach the same moment of decision. The question that haunts the radioactive dust of Mohenjo-Daro isn't what happened there 4,000 years ago. It's what's going to happen here tomorrow. Because the cycle isn't broken, the knowledge isn't lost, and the same forces that once turned sand to glass and cities to ash are still dancing in the hearts of atoms, waiting for their moment to teach the same lesson one more time. The Mound of the Dead stands as more than just an archaeological site. It's a mirror reflecting our own choices back at us across the millennia. A warning written in atomic fire about the price of reaching for the power of gods without the wisdom to wield it safely. And as the night deepens over those ancient ruins, as the residual radiation continues its slow decay in the stones that once housed a thriving civilization, the silence grows deeper and more profound. It's the silence of consequences. The silence of choices made and prices paid. The silence that waits at the end of every technological civilization that confuses capability with wisdom. The atoms are patient. Time moves in only one direction. And somewhere in the radioactive dust of the past, the future is already written in languages we're only beginning to remember how to read. But there's one final piece of evidence that researchers have been reluctant to discuss publicly. Something discovered in the deepest excavation layers of Mohenjo-Daro that challenges not just our understanding of ancient technology, but our assumptions about the nature of consciousness itself. In 1982, a team working in the restricted underground sections of the site uncovered what they initially thought was a natural cave formation. It was only when they began mapping its dimensions that they realized they were looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately carved from the living rock with a precision that defied explanation. The chamber was perfectly spherical, roughly 20 feet in diameter, with walls so smooth they seemed almost polished. But it wasn't the construction that made the discovery significant. It was what they found, preserved within those walls. Crystalline formations covered every surface, but these weren't natural mineral deposits. Under analysis, they revealed a structure that suggested they had been grown rather than formed through geological processes. Each crystal was identical in size and orientation, arranged in patterns that followed mathematical principles we were only beginning to understand. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a crystallographer brought in to study the formations, made an observation that still gives researchers pause. The crystals weren't just decorative. They appeared to be functional, designed to resonate at specific frequencies when exposed to electromagnetic fields. Together, they formed what could only be described as a three-dimensional harmonic matrix. But functional for what purpose? The answer may lie in understanding how consciousness itself interacts with matter at the quantum level. Because recent research in neuroscience has revealed that human awareness operates through quantum processes within brain cells, processes that can be influenced by external electromagnetic fields and crystalline structures. What if the chamber beneath Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just a room, but a consciousness amplification device? A technology that could expand human awareness beyond its normal limitations, allowing access to information and abilities that we would consider impossible. The Sanskrit texts describe exactly such capabilities. They speak of sages who could see across vast distances, who could perceive events in other times and places, who could access knowledge that existed beyond the boundaries of individual minds. These weren't considered supernatural abilities, but natural extensions of consciousness when properly trained and equipped. Archaeological evidence from other Indus Valley sites supports this interpretation. Circular chambers with similar acoustic properties, arrangements of stones and metals that would create specific electromagnetic fields, artifacts that show signs of having been designed to interact with the human nervous system in precise ways. It's as if the Indus Valley people had developed technologies that worked not through mechanical processes, but through direct interface with human consciousness itself. Technologies that required not just technical knowledge, but specific mental disciplines and awareness practices. This would explain the unique nature of their civilization, how they achieved such precise coordination across vast distances without apparent central authority, how they maintained social stability without visible enforcement mechanisms, how they accomplished feats of engineering and organization that seem impossible for their supposed technological level. They weren't just using tools, they were using expanded consciousness as a tool, accessing information and capabilities that individual minds couldn't achieve alone. But such technologies would come with their own risks. Because consciousness expansion doesn't just amplify wisdom and understanding, it amplifies everything, including fear, anger, and the darker impulses that drive human conflict. The chamber beneath Mohenjo-Daro shows signs of having been abandoned suddenly, its crystalline matrix left incomplete. Scorch marks on the walls suggest that something had gone catastrophically wrong during its final use. The patterns of damage are consistent with feedback loops, the kind of cascading failure that occurs when complex systems exceed their operational parameters. What if the nuclear destruction of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just a weapons failure, but a consciousness failure? What if the expansion of human awareness had opened doorways that couldn't be controlled, accessing forces and entities that proved too dangerous to contain? The Sanskrit texts hint at exactly such possibilities. They describe techniques for expanding consciousness that come with stern warnings about the entities and forces that become visible at higher levels of awareness. Beings of immense power and alien intelligence that exist in dimensions beyond normal human perception. Contact with such entities, according to these ancient accounts, requires careful preparation and strict protocols. Violation of these protocols can result in possession, madness, or worse. The consciousness becomes a doorway through which forces hostile to human existence can enter our reality. Could it be that the civilization that built Mohenjo-Daro had opened such a doorway and lost control of what came through? That their consciousness expansion technologies had attracted the attention of intelligences that viewed humanity as a threat to be eliminated? And so we return to where we began, standing in the ruins of a city that whispers secrets in languages we've forgotten how to speak. The sun sets over Mohenjo-Daro, casting long shadows across stones that have kept their silence for 4,000 years. But that silence isn't empty anymore. It's full of warnings, full of questions, full of the weight of choices that echo across millennia. Tonight, we've walked through the evidence, piece by disturbing piece. The melted bricks that shouldn't exist, the radiation readings that defy explanation, the skeletons scattered like broken dolls in streets where children once played, the ancient texts that describe weapons blazing like 1,000 suns, all of it pointing toward a truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about the past. Whether Mohenjo-Daro fell to primitive nuclear weapons, exotic consciousness technologies, or forces beyond human understanding, one thing remains clear. This wasn't just the end of a city, it was the end of a possibility. The end of a civilization that had found a different way to organize society, to harness energy, to exist in harmony with forces that we're only beginning to rediscover. And now, 4,000 years later, we stand at the same crossroads. We've split the same atoms, built the same weapons, unlocked the same terrible knowledge. The question that haunts those empty streets isn't what happened there long ago. It's what happens here tomorrow. The silence of the mound of the dead carries a message across the centuries, written in radioactive dust and atomic fire. Some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay. Some warnings are carved in stone and shadow, waiting for those wise enough to read them before it's too late. Sleep well, and remember, the atoms we split today are the same atoms they split millennia ago. The choice we face is the same choice they faced, and their silence is the sound of humanity's first wrong answer. echoing through time like the half-life of memory itself. Until we meet again in the shadows of forgotten worlds, this is Lost Mysteries. Sweet dreams.